A little bit about our trip. Over winter break, 6 Cornell Law students, myself included, 1 law professor and 1 alum, traveled down to Dilley, Texas, a town of around 4,000 people, in order to participate in a service project to assist recently arrived detained asylum seekers. We worked inside a center called the South Texas Family Residential Center, which is the largest family immigration center in the entire United States. We completed about a semester's worth of clinical work in 1 week, with a crash course in asylum law, client interviewing, immigration procedure, vicarious trauma, and written advocacy. We could only have gained so much experience in so little time by joining the Dilley Pro Bono Project, which graciously hosted us and a series of other volunteers, both legal and non-legal, in order to facilitate the process of preparing and helping the women and children detained at the center. The Dilley Pro Bono Project is an innovative legal services model that was born of a critical need for access to justice inside this detention center. When the residential center opened in December 2014, immigration advocates were appalled by the establishment of a permanent detention facility to incarcerate arriving families. Various organizations worked together to establish a permanent, on-the-ground team of lawyers and paralegals working in the center to directly assist detained families. Because there are so many families detained in Dilley, the Dilley Pro Bono Project relies on rotating teams of volunteer attorneys and legal assistants who travel to Dilley for a week or more at a time. For example, our trip took us there for 1 week, and there were other legal assistants and law students who were there for longer.
We just got breakfast, and we're heading to our first day in the residential center, which is not a prison or jail, because we're not allowed to call it that.
How are you feeling?
How am I feeling?
About your first day?
Extremely nervous. I really don't want to not follow up on questions or not fully flesh out a question and then miss out on a nexus or pretty much their case.
Most of what we spent our day in Dilley doing was assisting women and preparing them for what is called a credible fear interview, or what you'll hear us refer to as a CFI prep. This is an integral part of the asylum process in which they have to pass this interview with a positive finding with an asylum officer in order to leave the detention center. However, if the immigration officer has an indication that the person subjected to expedited removal has a fear of persecution and/or torture if they return to their home country, the asylum process is triggered.
But it's upsetting how much detail and specific sets of facts are required, especially for domestic violence situations. You have to keep prying for information, and it seems like we're not the one, we're not thinking it's not bad enough. We have to keep asking for more situations that would seem obvious, to a normal human. Of course you would leave that abusive situation and try to flee, but it wouldn't be enough for a normal asylum.
So what is the credible fear interview? The credible fear interview is a screening mechanism for asylum seekers. It is for people who cross into this country without paperwork or prior approval, and they are in a process called expedited removal. The people who go to the detention center are those who are not deported immediately after crossing over the border. As a result, they have to prove through this credible fear interview that they have an eventual claim for asylum.
At the beginning of each CFI prep interview, when you see them come in and you first see them and tell them, how are you? And you can tell that they haven't been asked how they are in a while. You offer them water, do you need to go to the bathroom, would your kid like some crayons to play with while you're in the interview, welcome to the United States. And you can tell that really means a lot to them because they haven't felt welcomed here since they got here, or even before, or even in their own home country, because they face so much persecution.
In essence, they go through this interview, tell their story, explain to this asylum officer why they and their child are afraid to return to their home country, and the asylum officer has to determine that they have about a 10% possibility of winning on the merits later in their asylum case.
Okay, so what is required to pass the credible fear interview? In order to pass the credible fear interview, the asylum seeker must show that there is a significant possibility that they will ultimately be granted asylum. This means demonstrating that their case has the potential, again around a 10% potential, to satisfy all of the elements of asylum under the Immigration and Nationality Act, Section A42A. This includes establishing, first, a well-founded fear, second, of persecution, and persecution is a harm of a serious nature. It has to be more than mere harassment, is the language. Also, unfortunately, poverty and lack of opportunities or inactive threats do not satisfy the persecution element. Third, the persecution needs to be perpetrated by the government or an entity that the government is unable or unwilling to control. For this element, it is important to show why it would not be safe for the asylum seeker to return anywhere within their home country. The fourth element is on account of. This is what's called the nexus. The persecution needs to be shown to be on account of what's to follow, the fifth element, 5 protected grounds of asylum. So there's race, which includes people of indigenous communities and other racial qualities, religion, nationality, political opinion, which includes like political activists. This really works well for political activists, organizers who have been very vocal about their political stances in communities and have been targeted specifically for their organizing work. And the fifth is a membership in a particular social group. So an example of a particular social group could be Guatemalan women seen as property. In Dilley, Texas, this particular social group was allowing women to pass the credible fear interview stage. But it's still unclear whether this would work ultimately in front of an asylum or in front of an immigration judge.
The credible fear interview is one of the many times the asylum seekers will have to relive and retell their deepest traumas to U.S. immigration officials, oftentimes in a language other than the one shared by the official. Our role at Dilley was to help the women and children prepare for this difficult process and to assess which pieces of their story were important to emphasize in order to pass the credible fear interview.
One thing that struck me the most after the first 2 days at Dilley at this detention center was how intensely unjust and arbitrary the asylum criteria is written as applied. So we had a client that we've been working on the last couple of days preparing her for her credible fear interview, and she experienced really horrific gang violence back in her country, and also intense domestic violence from her former partner. So as she's sharing these stories, it was really difficult to listen to, but also to know that we had to keep pushing her or keep trying to examine more angles because she hadn't experienced the right kind of trauma and victimization. And so it felt like saying that the horrors that she had to endure just weren't good enough for the purposes of this statute.
So much irony in the fact that I feel like our culture really prides you like keeping your struggles and like your traumas in, and then like we walk into this interview with a woman and it's like so frustrating when like you're really trying and you're like, I'm really trying to help you, and like there's such a barrier of like, I'm trying to help you but you need to tell me all of your vulnerabilities right now, like right away. But that's like the only way that we can help you is for you to spill it.
I know that right now we just watched President Trump talk about how these refugees are trying to murder us, which is insane when you talk to them. But like, obviously the buck stops before that. But the question is sort of where, you know, like at what point do you blame people for participating in something that already exists and ask them instead to create something different? And where does that blame fall? Like at what point are we responsible for doing more? And at what point do we exculpate people for doing what already exists?
So I guess the predominant thought while I've been here is that, you know, but for the decisions of, you know, my great grandparents, that easily could be me and my sisters in that situation. And, you know, there's no doubt in my mind that my mom would go through exactly the same thing as any parent would, as any American would, to safeguard the life and liberty of their children.
Well, our first clients are going to have their credible fear interviews, which is both exciting and nerve-wracking because I hope they do well. That'll be exciting, but it's nervous to watch them go.
And what happens if the asylum seeker does receive a positive result in their credible fear interview? If the asylum seeker receives a positive result from the credible fear interview, they will be referred to regular removal proceedings. This is a process under Section 240 of the Immigration and Nationality Act, and they can present an asylum claim before the immigration judge at that point.
Hang on here. Okay. I'd like to welcome our viewers to the tour to Dilley Tacos. The goal is to eat every taco in Dilley by the time we leave. I think that's important.
At every taco place. If we eat every taco, Dilley will be out of tacos.
That's the goal. I was not mistaken.
I think tacos are like a renewable resource.
Hi everyone, my name is Lizbeth Cordova. I'm a third-year law student at Cornell, and I was part of the winter service trip to the border. I was only part of the second leg of that trip in Tijuana, working with Otro Lado. Otro Lado is a nonprofit legal organization that hopes to help asylum seekers get a better idea of what the asylum process will be like once they cross the border, and what the legal requirements for seeking asylum in the United States is. At first, I felt doing that work, I felt a little useless because we were just hearing the stories that the people were telling us and trying to determine whether, in our opinion, they had a viable claim to pass just the first phase of the asylum process, which is, do they have a credible fear? And so I felt useless in the way that I couldn't help them, right? Of course, I couldn't change their story, and it felt like I wasn't really doing anything. That was the first day. However, as the days went by, I understood the need for this service that Otro Lado is providing, because this is an opportunity for them to sit down with legal volunteers and be told, the chances of your asylum claim being accepted are maybe very low, and consider whether you want to embark on this dangerous and long journey for seeking asylum. And I think that it is something that, unfortunately, not a lot of asylum seekers get. And even though many people may have very sad stories, and they're definitely fleeing violence, and they're definitely fleeing bad conditions, unfortunately, those conditions may not be seen as proper asylum claims under the law. And so I think it's very important for them to get an understanding of what the asylum process is like here in the United States, and whether or not they would actually be granted asylum, or whether they would be stuck in, whether it be detention centers, or whether they would be stuck wearing an ankle monitor for a year or even more.
Despite having spent only a few days across the border in Tijuana, Mexico, working with refugees seeking asylum in the United States, the illegal acts happening just across the border are indisputable. I and several other students and professors from Cornell Law School traveled to Tijuana to work with an organization providing critical legal advice to asylum seekers. We spoke with countless people, advised them on their rights as they seek asylum, informed them on what the asylum process would be like for them, and discussed their asylum claims. Now, by federal law, a person may seek asylum by proclaiming at a point of entry into the United States that they are afraid to return to their home country. This triggers the asylum process, and that person has the opportunity to be heard in asylum proceedings. A person may also step onto U.S. soil and then apply for asylum within the first year they are in the country. What I witnessed happening at the Tijuana border is that people seeking asylum are turned away from the point of entry. This process is called metering. This process of delaying consideration for an asylum claim is called metering, and it is illegal. Asylum seekers are turned away to something called the list. But let's break this down. An asylum seeker will go to a port of entry and say they are too scared to return to their home country. Completely in line with U.S. law and regulations controlling the asylum process, the asylum seeker will immediately be turned away under the explanation that the U.S. government, which processes thousands of other immigration applications each day, only has the capacity to accept a tiny, arbitrary, and constantly changing number of people each day. Immigration officials will then tell the asylum seeker that there is some list that they must sign up on, wait until their number is called for their asylum process to begin.
You never noticed them?
We pass by them every
Once
day.
asylum seekers get this number, they must wait weeks or even months before their number is called, often without money or shelter, and constantly living in fear that their persecutor may find them. Asylum seekers patiently and anxiously arrive every morning to listen for their number, or else risk letting their chance to present themselves slip by. If they miss their number, they must get a new one and begin the wait all over again. During my time helping asylum seekers with their cases, the highest capacity the U.S. government was able to process was just 45 people. Both the U.S. government and the Mexican government deny their sponsorship of the list, and migrant volunteers have been vested with the responsibility for taking down and calling names, in an attempt to maintain plausible deniability. Meanwhile, Mexican officials hover around the site, answering questions, and U.S. government buses drive off with people whose numbers have been called that day. It's clear that these governments support and sponsor the illegal list, deferring to its extra-legal authority and referring asylum seekers to it. The practice of turning asylum seekers away at the border is illegal. The process of referring asylum seekers to this extra-legal list is illegal and outside of asylum protocol.
The work that Otro Lado is doing and that we were able to do was very important, and I believe it definitely fills a void needed by the asylum seekers. It was a great experience. I felt extremely lucky to be a part of this trip, and I'm very grateful to have had the opportunity to join the group. I am a first-generation daughter of immigrants, so I understand what it's like for people to flee their country, and it was just incredibly rewarding for me to be able to give back to the community and to help people's journey, even if it was just a tiny bit. So thank you so much to any sponsors, and I hope that more students and more volunteers are motivated to go help people at the border and just inform them of the asylum process and of the rights that they have.